Mercifully, we are approaching the end of the long 1990 article Investing Chernobyl, written by Chernobyl liquidation veterans and nuclear power plant workers. Let us remind ourselves why we have spent so much time on this thing, boring and confusing many people who have experienced the misfortune of clicking on one of these videos. Despite being authored by people with direct experience of Chernobyl, the article was written in what is referred to as a peculiar historical period where the information reaching the public was, let us say, curated. And so this particular article was consigned to a local newspaper and limited publicity. The truth of it notwithstanding. We have decided to give it more attention and publicity, as the points raised in it mirror the much better known International Atomic Energy Agency INSAG 7 report published roughly 2 years later, and in some instances provide supplemental information. This article also benefits from not needing to heed diplomatic considerations, and therefore states highly significant takeaways plainly, rather than trying to equivocate. We are now on the 5th violation that the article authors put in quotation marks to convey irony and sarcasm. The 6 violations the article focuses on are a direct reference to the table of alleged violations Soviet nuclear power experts submitted to the IAEA 4 years earlier to substantiate why the operators of Reactor 4 were responsible for the Chernobyl disaster. So, the article authors refer to the official wording of blocking of protection systems relying on water level and steam pressure in the drum separator. In the RBMK coolant loop, steam separator drums separated steam subsequently sent to electricity producing turbogenerators from water coming out of the reactor core that was mixed with subcooling feed water and recirculated through the reactor core. Both the water level and the steam pressure were monitored in these drums and had certain limits attached to them. The article authors highlight the listed consequence of the actions of the operators as being the reactor protection by thermal parameters was completely disabled. Then the article authors proceed to call what they just quoted complete misinformation. Both parameters under consideration had upper and lower safety limits. In claiming that the reactor protection by thermal parameters was completely disabled, Soviet nuclear power experts implied that all safety limits had been disabled. Or, in other words, with 2 parameters having 2 limits each, that 4 protections were disabled. Without any recourse to information outside of what Soviet experts were claiming, even some workers of RBMK nuclear power plants concluded that the Chernobyl operators were guilty. Yet these safety parameters, unlike the operating reactivity margin, or number of control rods in the core, were amply monitored and documented. There were at least 3 monitoring and recording devices for each parameter. There was warning and emergency signaling, both visual and auditory. There were automatic reactor shutdown systems, and finally, there were the operating instructions. So which protections for these parameters were actually disabled? According to the authors, none. They were all in operation. The upper limits for water level and steam pressure in the separator drums were untouched. There is one limit where a degree of complexity is involved, and that was the lower limit for the water level. The operators were supposed to change the set point from minus 1100 millimeters to minus 600 millimeters. Make sure to note that nothing was disabled. Rather, it was not enabled. We will turn to this matter when we look at the corresponding text in INSAG 7, because there is a very meaningful distinction between disabling and not enabling here that most people fail to appreciate, if they have ever encountered or attempted to process it. A lower limit protection remained in operation at minus 1100 millimeters. But for now, let's say in quotation marks, the operators committed a violation in not transferring this lower limit to minus 600 millimeters. Did this violation affect the disaster? The article authors state no, since the parameter immediately before and during the experiment was higher than minus 600 millimeters. Let's turn to section 1-4.7.4 of INSAG 7 on pages 74 to 76 to affirm and expand on what we just read from the article. This section tells us that the drop in reactor power was accompanied by a reduction in the water level and steam pressure in the steam separator drums. The water level did fall below the minus 600 millimeter emergency set point without the reactor being shut down. Again, rather than disabling this set point based protection, what the operators did was not enable it. This was a violation, which will be clarified shortly. However, protection against water level reduction in the steam separator drums below the minus 1100 millimeter level was in operation, voiding the statement in INSAG 1 that all thermal parameter reactor protection systems were switched off. Then comes the real kicker. In a note, the designers of the RBMK are quoted. The source is Nikiat, the chief design engineer of the project, who, alongside the scientific manager, i.e. the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, were mostly responsible for the design of the RBMK units. The quote is as follows. Automatic reswitching of the set points of EPS1 and EPS5 during emergency fluctuations of the water level in the steam separator drums is not permitted, since during operation of any of the emergency protection systems 1, 2, and 3, the water level falls to the minus 600 millimeter set point on the instrument, which has a range of plus 400 to minus 1200 millimeters. This, in turn, will result in actuation of EPS5 and complete shutdown of the reactor. This quote shows that the designers of the RBMK did not implement a complete automatic protection system against a low water level in the steam separated drums in the operational circumstances on the night of the Chernobyl disaster, because they explicitly did not want the reactor to be automatically shut down when the water level fell to minus 600 millimeters. The note comments on the extremely simple way out of this. Instead of automatic reswitching of the set points and an automatic shutdown of the reactor, it was left to the operators to manually switch the set points and thus shut down the reactor. In the context of the designers explicitly not wanting the reactor to be shut down. Do you see where this is going? In the following paragraph, it is pointed out an automatic engineering solution was possible, but keeping the reactor running was prioritized. So how was this design decision reflected in operation? Let's turn to section 1-4.6.1 on page 63 and note the title of it. Period of normal operation and preparations for the tests. On page 64, we encounter the following paragraph. During the period from the beginning of power rise to stabilization of the reactor parameters at 200 megawatts, at about 123, normal technical processes and operations were taking place at the unit, except for the switching on of the fourth MCP pair. These included triggering of the fast-acting systems for dumping steam to the condenser, manual control of the water level in the steam separator drums, overcompensation of the reactor, etc. Among the normal technical processes listed is manual control of the water level in the steam separator drums, the particular emergency set point for which was under manual control rather than automatic protection, because the designers explicitly did not want the reactor to be shut down upon the particular emergency marker being hit. Manually controlling the reactor around this emergency set point was normal practice. There is another wrinkle to this. Page 12 of INSAG 7 identifies another instance of a timing being changed, much as the timing of the disabling of the two-turbine disconnection trip was changed that we discussed in the preceding video. Soviet experts claimed that the protection systems based on steam pressure and water level in the steam separator drums were disabled at 119, in proximity to the runaway and explosions. This was part of how Soviet experts dramatized their own narrative, constructing their own block of Swiss cheese that the operators ate through on their way to disaster. Call it Soviet Swiss cheese for its marketing is dramatically different from its quality. As with the two-turbine disconnection trip, Soviet experts changed timings they were well aware of for reasons they were well aware of, to make it seem like operators were given multiple chances in close proximity to the disaster to take an off-ramp, no matter how many violations they had already committed. Let's look at the timeline on page 54 of INSAG 7. You can see the set point change of the steam pressure being at 0036 rather than at 119, which is what the text we were just looking at was focusing on. But at the moment we're focusing on the water level. On this timeline you can see 6 emergency water fluctuations. We know that the operators were manually controlling the water level rather than resorting to shutting the reactor down, because the designers did not want the reactor to be shut down. But there is even more to this. Note how 4 of the 6 emergency fluctuations occur at 1 AM and before, or before the 2 additional main circulation pumps were connected to the reactor at 103 and 107. Why is this notable? Check out what else Soviet nuclear power experts, led by Valery Legasov, were feeding their international counterparts in 1986. First, we turn to pages 15 to 16 of INSAG 1, the 1986 IAEA report on the Chernobyl disaster, written under the heavy influence of Soviet experts. After the lie that operation under 700 megawatts was forbidden, we encounter the false violation allegation of a total reactor flow value being exceeded. We have already covered both of these topics in previous videos. This report claims that as a consequence of the connection of the additional main circulation pumps and a high total flow rate, the operators disabled reactor trips on water level and steam pressure in the steam separator drums. We'll get to the steam pressure next, but here we clearly see the false timing of the disabling of these protection systems, which were never disabled, being linked to the connection of the 2 additional main circulation pumps. Now, why does this matter? because here we get insight into the narrative machinations of Soviet experts. Soviet experts had a tall task. They couldn't just lie about one thing. They had to lie about many things. They needed an entire chain of made-up violations to show how the Chernobyl operators went through a series of roadblocks Soviet experts put in their path, thus defending themselves and making the operators accountable. Remember from the previous video how the man Valery Legasov swore to secrecy, stated that success in Vienna was predicated on blaming the operators so that the Soviet nuclear power industry could continue operating independently. Reparations wouldn't need to be paid, etc. The Soviet Swiss cheese model of disaster is how the operators were successfully scapegoated. Don't buy it, it's not good for you, and makes you look like an idiot. On page 24, we see the explicit stringing together of these false allegations. After the lie that 200 megawatts was a power level forbidden for continuous operation, the following is written. While this was a major violation of operating procedure, it was not in itself enough to have caused the accident. Later actions compounded the problem. For their purpose, Soviet experts needed to clear a high bar of violated redundancies, and they made this clear. The following two paragraphs link the steam separator parameters and the purported disabling of protection systems based on them to the connection of the two additional main circulation pumps, thereby linking violation to violation to violation, digging a deep hole to bury the operators in. Yet this was nonsense. Rather than at 1:19, some 4 to 5 minutes before the explosions, the steam pressure set point was changed at 36 minutes past midnight. 4 of the 6 emergency water level fluctuations occurred prior to the connection of the 2 additional main circulation pumps, and they were controlled manually as part of normal practice because the RBMK designers explicitly did not want an actual automated system that would shut the reactor down upon a water level emergency fluctuation. And that is the level at which the masters of weaponized narration operate, and the level at which YouTube content creators, book authors, professors, entertainers, documentary writers, journalists, Wikipedia editors, etc., whatever, do not. A recent Reddit post reinforces our interpretation. The post features a KGB document from 1987 that was a translation of a French brochure or booklet on the Chernobyl disaster. A single line is of particular interest to us in this context. After the 6 violation allegations against the operators are mentioned, the following is written. Soviet experts stated that had even one of these errors not occurred, the accident would not have happened. We don't know if this was another particularly revealing Soviet expert oral statement that wasn't put on paper, or if Soviet experts wrote it down somewhere, but they were explicitly making the argument we're describing of linking violation allegations and emphasizing the importance of each, thus establishing a false notion of redundant protection, a Soviet Swiss cheese model of disaster. They went to the length of manipulating timings to streamline their deceitful narrative and indeed dramatize it. People usually think of the HBO miniseries being a deliberate dramatization for effect, despite its creator stating multiple times his intention was to the contrary. Whereas they have no idea how far Soviet experts themselves went to dramatize Chernobyl where it suited them. Legasov's dramatic performance at Vienna it turns out, was not incidental. It was integral to placing the blame on the operators. When Adam Higginbotham summarises Legasov's performance on page 276 of Midnight in Chernobyl, do note the additional irony of Higginbotham himself not realising just how masterful it was. Legasov had successfully misled multiple generations, and counting. The steam pressure set point change is simpler. What the operators did was change the set point at which a protection would activate. In this instance, one that would switch off the turbine. The article authors describe these low pressure set points as stepwise. When the pressure drops to 1, a turbine is switched off. When the pressure drops to the lower value, the remaining turbine in the unit pair is switched off as well. What the operators did at 36 minutes past midnight was change the set point from the higher value to the lower value, with one of the turbines already having been switched off. In other words, this was about as unremarkable of an action as it gets. What does INSAG 7 write on this matter? Well, it really is that straightforward. At 36 minutes and 24 seconds, the personnel changed the set point for switching off the turbine of the protection system to guard against reduction in steam pressure in the steam separator drums from 55 kg force per centimeter squared to 50 kg force per centimeter squared. These personnel actions were in accordance with requirements of the operating documentation since, according to section 12 of the procedures for reswitching keys and straps of the engineered protection and blocking systems, personnel were entitled to select this set point. Contrary to what is stated in official documents, the Commission does not consider that personnel should be held to blame for having blocked the steam pressure protection system of the steam separators. The fact that Soviet experts attempted to twist something so blatantly uncontroversial is a testament to just how far the lies of Chernobyl went, and with good reason. Again, Soviet experts needed an entire series of unforgivable violations to paint the operators sufficiently guilty so as to weasel themselves and the Soviet nuclear power industry out of the immediate existential threat they were facing. Refer to the previous video of how both Valery Legasov and Soviet leader Gorbachev were cognizant of this problem. As usual, the truth gets even worse for Soviet experts. The note on page 76 of INSAG 7 points out that the protection system associated with a low steam pressure in the steam separator drums was only designed to stop the turbine and was not, as Soviet experts claimed, a thermal parameter reactor protection system. The reactor itself would not be shut down. So, it appears that when bringing up a turbine power of less than 100 megawatts electric, the authors of this paragraph are referring to when both turbines would be switched off or separated from steam supply, per operating instructions. In these circumstances, there would be no protection system whatsoever against a pressure reduction. Given the void and power coefficients of reactivity at Chernobyl, which once again are made clear to not having been dependent on an ORM violation, or on a violation of how many control rods were left in the core, the reactor could have run away if water were to boil in a number of scenarios. The article authors also comment on this insufficient protection aspect. They call the stepwise shutdown of both turbines a half measure, if not less. They too note that when the turbines are already switched off, or with a small load, there is practically nothing to turn off, and thus, this reactor protection does not exist. They go even further in bringing up a scenario where even with the turbines being under high load, their shutdown in the event of a sharp and deep decrease in steam pressure would not be enough. If pressure were to drop low enough, water in the reactor core would boil and circulation will be disrupted. According to the article authors, even by 1990, a special system of forced water circulation through the core for such cases was not implemented in any of the operating RBMKs. It should be pointed out, however, that by this time, Soviet nuclear power experts had decisively changed the profile of RBMK cores. The positive void coefficient of inadmissibly high magnitude was gone, and with it, the positive power coefficient of reactivity was gone as well. RBMK reactors had a self-regulating rather than self-amplifying quality, like other nuclear power reactors worldwide. While meltdowns are a risk, runaway reaction explosions were not, as far as we are aware. The runaway property that made Chernobyl possible was not there any longer. The article authors summarise what we've covered in this video as follows. In reality, none of the protections based on the steam pressure and water level in the steam-separated drums were disabled. The single nominal violation was the operators not changing the lower limit water level set point. The operators having to change this set point manually came from a desire of the RBMK designers to not have the reactor shut down automatically upon the particular value being hit. Therefore, the operators controlling the water level and correcting emergency fluctuations was normal operating practice, rooted in the priorities of the RBMK designers. Furthermore, these parameters were normal at the time of the final rundown test. Page 65 of INSAG 7. The unit shift supervisors considered that preparations for the test had been completed and, having switched on the oscilloscope, gave the order to close the emergency stop valves. These were closed at 1:23:04. At this time, and for the following approximately 30 seconds of rundown of the 4 MCPs, the parameters of the unit were controlled, remained within the limits expected for the operating conditions concerned, and did not require any intervention on the part of the personnel. Page 66 of INSAG 7. Thus, neither the reactor power nor the other parameters, pressure and water level in the steam-separated drums, coolant and feed water flow rates, etc., required any intervention by the personnel or by the engineered safety features from the beginning of the tests until the EPS5 button was pressed.